George Harrison was the quiet one in the Beatles, a man of meditative calm and spiritual depth. He rarely raised his voice and seldom lashed out publicly. Yet beneath that composed exterior lay a simmering bitterness that grew over time. It was subtle, personal, and often invisible to fans and the media. Harrison's frustration was not loud, but it was real. As the youngest member of one of the most influential bands in history, he spent years navigating a world dominated by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, where his own voice was often overshadowed. Early years in Liverpool, George Harrison's musical journey began humbly in Liverpool. As a teenager riding the school bus, he met Paul McCartney, a connection that would shape his life. The two bonded over skiffle, rock and roll, and trading records. Paul was older, confident, and assertive, while George was quiet, eager to learn, and impressionable. That contrast drew George toward him, just as it would later draw him to John Lennon's creative brilliance. When Harrison first auditioned for the Quarrymen in 1958, he was only 15, too young for Lennon's initial approval. McCartney intervened, and George played impressively, opening the door to history. Joining the Beatles. Being the youngest in a band led by Lennon and McCartney meant stepping into someone else's story. In the early days, Lennon and McCartney shaped the Beatles' identity as primary songwriters and visionaries. George followed, learned, and absorbed their energy, often content to play a supporting role. The early admiration he felt for their talent slowly set the stage for frustration. He had ideas, creativity, and a growing understanding of music, but the spotlight rarely turned toward him. He was the quiet Beatle, perceived by the public as reserved, while privately feeling increasingly sidelined and artistically constrained. The strain of artistic suppression. As the Beatles' fame skyrocketed, Harrison's creative voice often went unheard. He proposed songs, offered guitar arrangements, and sought input, only to be passed over or second-guessed. Paul McCartney, ever the perfectionist, could dominate sessions without realizing the subtle effect on George. Harrison later reflected that Paul ruined me as a guitar player, not out of malice, but from years of being subtly undermined. Lennon and McCartney's partnership functioned like an empire within the band. George wasn't merely left out, he was left behind, simmering quietly as the tension within him hardened over the years. Growth as a songwriter. By 1968, during the White Album sessions, Harrison had grown significantly as a songwriter and musician. His confidence and ambition had evolved, but the studio dynamics had not. Paul McCartney had assumed a controlling leadership role, while Lennon's focus was increasingly elsewhere. George, no longer willing to suppress his frustration, found the environment stifling. This period highlighted the widening gap between his artistic potential and the reality of collaboration under McCartney's direction. The once admiring follower had become a man with his own creative vision, ready to push back against repeated artistic marginalization. Let It Be and the Breaking Point. The Let It Be sessions in early 1969 exposed the fractures within the band. Cameras captured less collaboration than tension, with George increasingly frustrated by the controlling dynamic. During one session for Two of Us, Paul tried directing Harrison's guitar part, prompting George to respond quietly but firmly, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It was not sarcasm, but resignation, a subtle white flag signaling that he was exhausted by the constant undermining. Witnesses described the atmosphere as unpleasant, and George temporarily left the band, reaching his breaking point. Returning on new terms. George returned to the Beatles after a brief departure, but the relationship had changed. He began working on songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, masterpieces that demonstrated his true capability when left to his own devices. Yet the rift between him and McCartney had widened permanently. Though he contributed to the band's later works, the emotional damage was already done. Harrison's growing independence as an artist highlighted both his talents and the long-standing tension that would never fully disappear. A quiet rebellion against the constraints of the Lennon-McCartney dominance. The Beatles breakup. The Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, But for George Harrison, the split was deeply personal. While the media focused on Lennon and McCartney's conflicts, Harrison quietly severed emotional ties, particularly with McCartney. Publicly, he maintained polite interviews, but privately, he carried years of unresolved resentment. The breakup allowed him creative freedom, but also crystallized the loss of camaraderie. Harrison's journey had always been one of navigating admiration, love, and subtle bitterness, and the band's end provided both relief and a permanent wound. Solo career and artistic vindication. In 1971, Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album showcasing songs previously rejected by the Beatles. The work was a creative triumph, commercially successful and critically acclaimed. Tracks like Wah Wah contain subtle but biting lyrical commentary, interpreted as a critique of McCartney's controlling nature. In 1973, Sue Me, Sue You Blues further reflected Harrison's frustration with legal disputes following the breakup. These solo efforts allowed him to channel years of suppressed emotion into art, affirming his artistic identity while processing the complex relationships that had defined his time with the Beatles. Personal life and reflection. In the final decades of his life, Harrison retreated from public life, focusing on his family at Friar Park, his Henley-on-Thames estate. Even during illness, his wit and philosophical nature remained intact. In a 2001 online chat, when asked if Paul still annoyed him, Harrison quoted a Victorian proverb, reflecting both forgiveness and subtle critique. Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass. Harrison remained thoughtful, measured, and quietly critical, a man who had learned to navigate complex relationships without public drama. Final years and legacy. During his last days, Harrison received visits from old friends, including McCartney. Their final encounter was quiet and intimate, a far cry from the tension of their youth. Paul described it as a moment of closeness, holding hands, joking, and talking like brothers who had weathered decades of shared history. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, surrounded by loved ones. His final words were simple: love one another. Yet even in death, the complexities of his relationships, particularly with McCartney, remained nuanced, reflecting a life of admiration, conflict, and subtle, enduring resentment. Conclusion: The Silent Rebellion. George Harrison's legacy is one of musical brilliance, spiritual depth, and quiet defiance. He was never the loudest Beatle, yet his contributions and personal struggles left an indelible mark on music history. Through years of marginalization and tension, Harrison found ways to express his voice, both in song and in life, often without confrontation, but with unmistakable clarity. His story reminds us that silence does not equal submission, and that hidden bitterness can coexist with wisdom, creativity, and love. Harrison's quiet rebellion speaks volumes, enduring long after the band's final note.